So we just saw Noah, the new Darren Aronofsky movie with Russell Crowe playing the lead role. The way this show works is we give kind of a quick overview of what we thought of the movie, whether we liked it or not, whether we think people should see it or who we think should see it, who probably would like it or who wouldn't like it. And then we kind of dig in a little bit more detail. So hopefully you can get kind of a quick feel for whether we thought it was okay or not before we get into too much depth, or into spoiler territory potentially or anything like that.
If you haven't read the story or heard the story at some point.
Hey, it's not like it's exactly the same as what you're
not
used to. So starting for myself, this was it was a really tough sell. I saw the trailer and thought, who is this for? And I watched the movie and I thought, who is this for? It's really well told from a visual perspective. The storytelling is really good. The acting is fine. The script is kind of some of the stuff they say to each, like the dialogue is kind of like, it's like on the fence kind of stuff. It's like somewhere between the way people talk in the Bible and the way people talk in a bad movie. And I honestly, there were parts of it that I thought were really great, and there were parts of it that were just either dull or really out of place or out of character. It seemed just kind of weird. So to me, it's like a 50% kind of movie. Like, there's some stuff that I could tell you I liked about it. There's stuff I could tell you I didn't like about it. It's not something that I feel really strongly either way about, so I can't necessarily say recommend it to go see it, but it's also really well made, and you can see that a lot of work and a lot of artwork went into it. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I felt a little more strongly about it than you did, Dale. I really enjoyed the movie. Part of my reasoning for that, and we can go into more detail with this later on, but I've been hearing Bible stories my whole life, and I've seen a lot of movies, a lot of Bible stories. This is the first one I can say I actually had any kind of imagination behind it. That really was able to take the bold step and say, I'm going to commit to what this looks like, whether or not it necessarily works all the time, and it doesn't 100% of the time, but there are points where it's like, well, that's just a gutsy way to visualize it, and it's very committed to doing it that way.
Yeah, that's true.
And I think that as someone we just watched God's Not Dead last week, as someone who's been raised, and I've seen a lot of quote-unquote Christian movies, and I wouldn't call this a Christian movie as such, definitely, it's a Bible story.
But Cal and I saw Son of God.
Oh, well, okay. Well, and you guys maybe could have a better comparison to that than I could. But I think for a good 3/4 of the movie, probably until it starts running out of gas a little bit in the back end. But it was easily, for any Bible story I've seen dramatized or visualized, it's easily the most exciting, the most thought-provoking.
Yeah, I can agree with that.
And this is, this is someone who, I think I read this story to my son not 2 nights ago, So,
yeah.
This is, I read the biblical account before I saw the movie even, because I wanted to sort of remember what was in there and what wasn't. And so, as someone who's still kind of in a very strong Bible story environment, I thought it was really thrilling, and the stuff that was added, and they didn't change a lot in the narrative, but the stuff that was added, I thought was actually very thematically resonant. So, I really liked it a lot, and we'll kind of go into more detail later on. So,
what'd you think?
I feel like I'm still kind of processing it.
Yeah.
There's a lot in it. It was a little bit slower than I thought it was going to be. It's a bit of a slow burn to get going, and then it kind of peters out towards the end.
Yeah.
But there's definitely some really cool sequences. My favorite part was actually the visual sequences of creative stuff happening, and just the way the compression of time and
that stop motion stuff was killer.
Very, very cool, very vivid, and I really like that. I like that. I like Russell Crowe as an actor, but this is not really a Russell Crowe movie to me. He's very. I felt like it was Noah, like he was trying to play it didn't feel like, oh, this is a Russell Crowe movie. It just I thought he played a good character, although there were some things I felt were kind of felt artificially just added in there to add more story arcs and stuff, especially the cabin fever stuff. But it felt kind of shoehorned in there. But I understand that you're making a big epic movie. You gotta I guess in the actual stuff, there's not that many details, so they've got to add artistic license.
Yeah, you know,
create some stories that may or may not have happened. You know,
I read something and they noted, and this is true in the biblical account, which is 3 chapters in the book of Genesis. Noah doesn't actually have any lines. He doesn't say.
Right.
He has no words that are spoken in the biblical account. The biggest change is that in the biblical story, each of his sons has wives. And so they all and which is a big linchpin thing that's changed in this, and ends up being kind of a big, especially in the last quarter of the movie, it ends up being kind of a big principal conflict.
So before we get too far into that, I mean, would you recommend it as an epic movie to go see?
It is an epic movie. I would recommend it as a good weekend movie. Definitely one to take your girlfriend to or whatever. It's definitely it's funny because directed by Darren Aronofsky, as far as I know, it's the first big movie he's ever done of this scale, and yet it still felt small at parts, not in a critical way, but it still felt not stupid big. I still felt intimate, as if he was still making an indie movie. I felt it was in a good way.
Okay, so I mean we're kind of on the fence to positive on this, and we'll go in a little bit more detail about it, but hopefully that gives you kind of a feel for, what we thought of it overall, in general. The biggest thing this movie has going for it, I think, like Nate said, is the visual effects, the way it's presented, the way it looks. It's a very beautiful film. To criticize that a little bit, I wasn't a fan of the way that they used CGI for all of the animals. Every single animal was CG, and the other thing that really that would have been a little bit too much for me already. But then they add in the rock biters, which I'm going to elaborate on that in a second, but they have these things called the Watchers, which are fallen angels that
came to help
men, and then
they've been encrusted with rock. They're kind of like the Treebeards from Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, they definitely make you think of the Ents. There's actually in Genesis chapter 6, in the very first verse, they talk about there were giants walking, and I think the actual Hebrew word is Nephilim or something like that. It's a word that's very difficult to translate. So sometimes it's giants, sometimes it's sort of fallen ones. I mean, so it just depends on what translation you're looking at, and that's where that comes from. But yeah, they had a slightly Treebeard kind of spin to them.
Yeah. So they show up, and they're really, really hard to it's hard to suspend them being in part of this world. The rest of it is so, for example, the voice of God is never heard.
Yeah, it's all in visions.
Right?
Yeah.
And so
neither is the word.
And so those are choices that lend to it not being a supernatural kind of film. But then you have these supernatural creatures who, take everyone in the audience by surprise. Yeah. They're not featured in the trailer. They're not something that you really are expecting to see.
Yeah.
And what I thought was kind of funny was that when the first animal in the movie shows up, there's a fox or some kind of...
It's like an armadillo wolf or something.
Some kind of crazy animal. The way you're introduced to the animals, and then the rest of the men, the bad men, is this wolf fox thing walks by that's been hurt. It's been hit by an arrow or something, and Noah sort of calms it down, and it dies in front of Noah. And the first thing I thought when I looked at it was, hey, found a baby luck dragon. And then not 15 minutes later, we're introduced to the rock biters. And I'm like, so when is the racing snail going to come out and make this just never-ending story for the prequel?
Which, to be fair, I would definitely watch that movie.
So I thought what they were going for was that there are species of animals that don't make it, and that they're showing you animals that didn't make it on purpose.
Yeah.
But then once they start showing the real animals, they're all CG and sort of stylized.
Yeah,
as well.
and you know what? Actually, this is I guess when it's Industrial Light and Magic. Whoever made the animals, one of their things was that the animals weren't modern animals. The idea is that these are the only animals left. This is where everything kind of evolves from these animals. So they're not actual animals as we have. Now, I wish that's the only time you really get to see that. Because every other time you're saying, oh, it's basically a bear. It's basically an elephant.
Yeah.
And I think if you had more time to look at it, that'd be a better payoff. Which I think I like that idea, but it's kind of more a conceptual one than one that really, in practice, is always present there.
So yeah, and like I said, I wouldn't have minded so much if they just, went whole hog on the CG with the animals and went that direction if they hadn't added the supernatural side of it. I thought the rock monster guys were really, really like
yeah, the way the movie's almost approached more like mythology, and I mean like the way we and I don't mean like, oh, it's a myth. I mean in the sense of like how we would approach Greek mythology, how it's filmed, how J.R.R. Tolkien used the term mythology to describe Lord of the Rings, which is a very, this idea, there's not really a lot of difference between the supernatural and the natural, this idea of a divine being taking a very active interest. And it's really filmed like you would a big fantasy epic movie,
Yeah.
And I think, and you're right, you think the idea of of God instead of God actually speaking, because God does have lines in the biblical account,
Right.
And so I think that if you don't go in kind of expecting that could kind of sit weird. I didn't think it was too weird, but partially because I think I've seen a lot of movies that have had God speak, like in the Ten Commandments or Prince of Egypt and stuff like that, and it always sounds a little goofy to me.
That didn't bother me at all. I thought that was a solid choice. I guess what my point was that they made this choice to make it very it's an interpretive story.
Yes, it is very interpretive.
You're interpreting that Noah is either making a right or a wrong choice, and whether that's what God wants him to do, or whether he's making that choice on his own, or however. And sometimes they come out and say whether they think that that's what he's doing or not. And I thought that choice worked. What was distracting to me was we don't have a supernatural person or supernatural being that exists in the original story. We have supernatural beings that we've just invented and thrown into this movie.
or at least they don't have a prominent figure in the original account.
Yeah, I mean, I've never, like, I know what the Nephilim are. I've heard of them before, and this is a poor like comparison to make, but it's sort of like the I, Frankenstein style of like angels and demons, which I don't know if you guys have seen that movie, or the Underworld movies.
Yeah, I haven't seen Underworld, but I know the kind of the...
I, Frankenstein really has nothing to do with Frankenstein. He's in it, but it's really about the angels, which are gargoyles they're gargoyles that turn into like... They can turn to stone and turn out of stone. So they're very similar to these...
Because why not?
These rock monster things. And the demons are just like regular dudes that when they decide to be evil, they just look like slightly uglier, blurry dudes. And that was the thing I kept kind of coming back to was, if you're going to have a supernatural element to a biblical story... Why not use God? Why not use actual stuff from the Bible that's supernatural?
Yeah, and that's a fascinating way to look. I think I could go either way on the Watchers. I like the way they're utilizing the story, and I think thematically I'm fascinated by them. I think one thing I really like is that the pre-flood section of the Bible is all of like 6 chapters in the whole Bible, and so I'm fascinated by this is like such a new concept of the world. And so there's kind of a world building thing that goes on there, and there's some parts that are so different from ours. It's not just that. It's not just the rock monsters. There's just a lot of small things, like they have the way they start fires. They just have like these little rocks that they just smash them and they just start a fire. And it's cool because it's never really explained, but it's just kind of this thing that this is how they operate. And I thought that, so they had a lot of these kind of small elements. The Watchers are a flagrant use of that, and it's one of those elements that might not completely work, but they are committed to it, and so they do not. They are not. He's not shy about going that way,
So I like that. I like the level of commitment overall in the movie.
It has a strong level of conviction to it that this is what I want to do.
And I also like that they take all of the unbelievable aspects of the story, the unbelievable aspects of the Noah story, and they just decide something. So they just decide that
putting the animals to sleep.
The animals go to sleep. That's why they don't eat.
They have like this kind of incense they burn to make the animals go to sleep.
So there's your explanation. The animals were asleep the entire time. They were in sort of a forced hibernation sort of a period. The use, I mean, really the purpose of to me, the plot purpose or the story purpose of the Watchers, the rock monsters, is to explain how they built the ark.
Yeah.
Because otherwise it's like, him and Jennifer Connelly and a couple of boys and,
and Hermione Granger.
And Hermione, Emma Watson's there. And,
I think one thing I liked about it was that it didn't shy away from the tough questions presented by the story.
Yeah.
This idea that, and this is one thing I think a lot of...
Well, and the procreation of men.
Yeah, and
it had its own spin on how do we get from Noah and his family to...
Right, and I think that one thing I really appreciate about this, and this is probably going to be a more challenging part for maybe Christian viewers, although maybe not Jewish ones, but the Noah himself is quite fallen. I mean, and he's not I think when you think of Noah, you think of this, nice man with a big white beard, basically Santa, who's basically he's a floating zookeeper, right? And it's not that kind of portrayal at all. He's very, very broken, very self-doubting. There's a lot of moments, and and this is, if God spoke to him once, why won't God speak to him now when he needs that? And the movie doesn't answer it. The movie doesn't say why it's done one way one time and one time not another.
Well, I mean, to be clear, in the context of the movie itself, God never speaks to
Noah. Yeah, I should say that
Noah has visions.
Yes.
One of which is a dream, one of which is like a drug-induced hallucination.
I should restate that. It's not, God doesn't actually speak. He's actually given clear visions about certain items and not about others.
He makes interpretations.
When there's an absence of guidance like that, he gets a really bad case of cabin fever.
Yeah. Which I've heard, this is the first Aronofsky movie I've seen, which I'm ashamed to say, but I've heard that that's actually a very common thread through a lot of his movies, is someone kind of latching onto an obsession and carrying it through to its logical conclusion, which can generally lead very bad. It leads to very dark places, and this movie goes to those places, which I think is I think it's really my biggest issue with the movie. It kind of for like an hour and a half, you're like, oh wow, this is really great. It gets really epic, and then once they're kind of on the arc, the movie kind of has to shift gears. There's kind of a forced villain confrontation when you get down to the end. That's a little, that's not
just there to be there.
Yeah, well, it's there because it needs something to kind of kick it.
And that's how a lot of the movie is. Like, you sort of, like, I can't fault them for adding conflict to a story that
at that point, basically, it doesn't have any anymore.
Right. Yeah. Without conflict, it wouldn't be a movie anymore. It would just be, there'd be 30 minutes of story, and it would be a 2-hour, visual show, and they would talk about things, and that would really be about it, which is, oddly enough, how, like, an hour of Son of God is.
Oh, really?
They just forget to have story or conflict or anything really going on. They're just like, they just sort of rest in neutral for a while.
So it's like we can't have it both ways.
We can't have it both ways. But what I will say, as a positive to this movie is infinitely more watchable than Son of God. It's not like, again, it's like, I'm sure there are people that are going to, and there already have been, and they've had to put like disclaimers into the trailer and stuff like that. There's people that get up in arms with it not, following the Bible exactly. If it followed the Bible exactly, it would be a 20-minute movie. That's not a movie.
And also kind of boring.
And also, like, we already know what happens. With Son of God, just to compare the two, both being biblical stories, not that they're, necessarily cut from the same thing. Son of God is, like, barely dramatized. It's like people in costume at a pageant, like, speaking. And this has there's characterization, there's relationships between the characters. They have scenes where there's dialogue, with them. They can hold more than one idea at the same time.
Yeah.
All that kind of stuff.
I would say thematically, it's a very dense movie. There's a lot. There's a lot of balls in the air, just with ideas that it's kicking around. And to its credit, I think it mostly handles it pretty well.
Yeah.
I think the environmental themes are really strong, and it's weird because it's not like the same kind of environmental, like, oh, it's not just a green movie and go, save the earth kind of thing. It's more like this world might already be broken, and it's very clearly made to be a parallel with our own. And again, probably a lot of people are going to have a problem with that. But in some ways, it's good because it doesn't let our own world off the hook. Yeah. It's not something that is just, yeah, exactly. It's something we can relate to. It's something that's not out there. It's something that's in here. There's recently been this big NASA study where they say, there's this big cataclysm coming in like the next 50 years or something. And that was kind of what it made me think of. And then the other side of that is humanity worth saving. On the other side, and the movie, the movie kind of says, yeah, but, so there's this kind of, it ends positively, and mostly, as positive as the end of the world can be, I guess.
Yeah.
But it does ask that question: is that we have to really see? Is that something that we're going to want to continue to be? Is that?
Yeah.
And so I really appreciated it. It dug its fingers into the story and really tried to get its hands dirty with it.
I was really happy that Noah was not a perfect character.
Yeah.
That he wasn't just, goody two-shoes all the way through.
Yeah, and that's one problem movies have, like Son of God would have, is because Jesus, how do you make Jesus fully God and fully human to satisfy people, to satisfy Christian viewers? Like, how do you make him an interesting character dramatically?
Martin Scorsese answered that question.
Yes, he did.
That's how
which has its own issues, but it is a really compelling movie. And really
that's how you
fascinating.
do it. You make him human. You show the human
You
side.
show
of
the
him.
struggles, and no one wanted to see that.
No.
At least certainly no Christians did. Yeah.
So that brings back sort of another sort of point about this is if this movie were called something else, if it weren't Noah, if it were Bob and the story of Bob, and it was just really heavily themed like the story of Noah, would that make it a better movie? And for me, I don't think it would make it a better movie necessarily. I think it's good that they made the choice that they did. I think that what it will do is there's people that, if it weren't called Noah, would be up in arms about it because it's trying to untell the Noah story.
Yeah.
And as it is, there's people that will go see it now because it is this sort of biblical story, and like you said, like it's a very good telling of the story.
It's certainly a very inventive one. I think that it's not. I think what people are going to have problems with, it's not a Sunday school telling of it. It's
not a literal version.
No, it isn't, and it's just not. It's not squeaky clean. It's not done with white gloves. Like I think a lot of times, certainly Christians will sanitize every Bible story and scrub over shortcomings of characters and just kind of lift them up as paragons. And this is something where it's like, no, Noah is human.
Right.
He is fallen just like everyone else. And all the characters are. No one's hands are clean when you get to the end of the movie.
But American Christians also need there to be blood in the movies because Americans need there to be blood in everything. So it's like
there's some of that too.
It's extra violent just to be extra violent.
It's more of a Lord of the Rings kind of extra violent, like a special effectsy kind of explodey violent.
Yeah.
Now, if you're the type
that's true, but Noah is also like, he's pretty damn good with a pike.
Yes,
like, he's got some freaking skills, like, better than like you would expect, a 600-year-old man like that's never supposedly taken a life, that doesn't pick flowers even, like that they show at the beginning. But I really don't want to come across like I'm pedantic and this movie was like, oh, this isn't real Noah. It's like it's not
sold out, man.
It's not supposed to be. It's supposed to be this.
But it deserves to be questioned because they did call it Noah.
Sure.
So if you're going to call something Noah and piggyback on that mythology and piggyback on that whole story that everyone's used to, then sure, you open yourself up to those questions. I think.
Yeah, I think if you look at it as a mythological story, as opposed to looking at it as, gospel truth, quote unquote gospel truth.
Yeah.
If you look at it as a mythological story, then you can have 20 different versions of Hercules. You can have 20 different versions of Clash of the Titans,
Yeah.
and they're all, interpretations of the same theme.
Yeah, I think you're right there. I will say, as someone who, probably a more progressive evangelical, I thought there's a lot to look at too. It's challenging to your preconceptions, and there's some things that I find troublesome about it. I'm going from the theological standpoint there, which I won't get into here. But I do think that if you try to go with like your Sunday school group, then yeah, maybe not that. But if you really want to be challenged with something like that, there is that. I think one thing I really liked about it, and this is always fun, and doesn't always lead to a coherent movie, but it always leads to an interesting one, is when this is Darren Aronofsky's like passion movie. He's wanted to make this movie, I guess, for years and years and years, and he had final cut on it, and it plays like a passion project. Like, this is something I've wanted to do, and he is so committed to it and so invested in what he's doing that even when it threatens to be a little goofy or a little over the top, he's so invested in it that it just for me, it kind of carries it through on some goodwill there. And so in that sense, it might end up being one of these kind of classics where you just see it and you're like, because the movie's really a little bonkers in places. Certainly, visually, it's just like, well, that's just insane, like the shot of the Earth pulled back, and it's like, the big eye of the typhoon that you see on like the Weather Channel, the whole Earth covered in these little typhoon eyes, and it's just this visual that's like,
yeah.
It's completely, like, I never thought of it that way, but that's a really cool way to show it. Mm-hmm.
And talking about like, taking it to a Sunday school or something like that, like, yeah, I can agree with you on that part of it, but I would say, like, compared to something like God's Not Dead or something like
no, it's not even in the same class.
Like this movie that's coming out called Heaven's for Real. That also kind of has the same sort of vibe to it, I think, as God's Not Dead. I think this is much more of a thought-provoking movie.
Yes.
Like, I think you and I could have more of a conversation about the actual themes of what they were trying to tell in the story versus how completely misguided it was. Like,
it is not made so Christians can pat themselves on the back and say, hey, we're pretty great, which is how a lot of Christians I think a lot of Christian movies kind of are shot that way. Certainly God's Not Dead was pitched that way, and it's not at all. It's challenging, it's kind of messy, and it is a little insane, and I think that's why I really liked it, because I think I tend to subscribe to the idea that there's no bad movies, just boring ones to some extent. And I think in that regard, I was not bored. Maybe just in like the last, it started kind of petering out there at the end. But that, I think that was more like the last like 10 minutes that I was starting to kind of, maybe the last 20 for me.
There are parts that drags, but it is not a boring movie. And that is the biggest sin that you can commit, is being boring. Son of God was definitely that. Like, there's like 45 minutes at the beginning that are pretty interesting. There's an hour of nothing. Yeah. And then there's like another hour after that where it kind of picks back up and starts telling the story again. Just kind of final thoughts. Like, I liked the movie okay. It was not worse than I expected it to be. It was not nearly as boring as I expected it to be. When you say we're going to make a 2-hour version of the Noah story, that really, really sounds like a mistake.
But then you say it's directed by Darren Aronofsky, and then you're like,
Well, but if you said it was directed by Terrence Malick, I would shoot myself in the head.
Yeah, I don't know about
Forget it.
I'm not sure I'm enlightened enough to handle that. Yeah.
Like, all of the stuff that I liked about it, that was beautiful about it, like, that makes up, 15 or 20 minutes worth of footage, and the rest of it is sort of, it is more the narrative, and it is more these sort of bold choices of, we're gonna examine this particular aspect of the story by introducing this character that's not really, accurate to the story that But I don't regret seeing it, it was fun to watch with
definitely worth a watch.
A couple people and
Yeah,
talk
and
about.
it's a very thought-provoking movie, and I mean that filmically, and if you're seeing it in a more religious context, which a lot of people will, one way or the other, you know, just to try and like make their own decision on it. There's a lot to talk about there too, as opposed to just kind of like, yeah, I feel nice now. It doesn't leave you feeling nice all the time.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I really appreciated about it. Visually, it is all over the place. Some stuff doesn't totally work. Some stuff really does. Mm-hmm. And it's so creative and so inventive in that regard. And you know, and the stuff that's addition is mostly their stuff that's in between the lines. The actual narrative itself, they don't change a whole bunch. Which I mean, if you're gonna make a 2-hour movie about Noah, you're gonna have to add stuff.
Yeah. The very obvious stuff you have to add in to make it a movie, to pad it out and keep you glued to your seat.
Yeah, and I think it's really worth watching. And the other thing, and you mentioned this earlier, aside from just being really thought-provoking, it's a very entertaining movie. I mean, it's just got like a lot of stuff like, wow, that's really insane. It might not be totally, it may be a little off the wall, but at least, but at least I saw something. I've never seen something like that before.
Right.
Which I think is one of the highest compliments when you say to a movie, I haven't seen something like that before, and I haven't. I've seen a lot of biblical epics, but I've never seen one done like that.
Hey, what was your take on the visual effects?
Pretty good. I mean, you know, all the CG animals and stuff, there were some long shots and whatnot. I mean, pretty good overall. The water stuff was cool with the actual ark. I don't know if they used some miniatures on that or what, but that was
I think
nice.
They actually did build a real ark, like just for the stationary scenes. I assume they didn't actually float one on the ocean.
Yeah, Russell Crowe was like talking about that in an interview that I saw.
It's an actual life-size ark to biblical dimensions, the 50 cubits by 70 cubits. Yeah, it's enormous, and it's not like a boat. It's really like a big floating warehouse. It's kind of what it looks like. It's not. It doesn't look seaworthy. It just looks like this is going to float.
It's like a boxcar. Yeah, like a monstrous boxcar.
And it has a real good sense of scale to it. I mean, you think in Noah's Ark, you're like, oh, it's a nice boat. No, it looks massive.
Yeah.
I mean, it takes up every shot that it's in. So
yeah. Well, cool. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Keep an eye on us here for more video reviews, and check out written reviews over at dalemaxfield.com. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.